aspek etik pemanfaatan teknologi digital dalam perkembangan anak dan perlindungan anak. Itu materinya beliau yang akan dibawakan. Baik, tanpa berlama-lama lagi, saya akan langsung simak. Kita akan langsung simak paparan dari Profesor Rimmer. Bagi Bapak Ibu yang ingin menyimak dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan switch interpretation ke dalam bahasa Indonesia di menu sebelah kiri bawah. Kemudian untuk yang mau bertanya, silakan ketik pertanyaannya di kolom chat dan Q&A. Kepada Profesor Rimmer, waktu kami persilahkan.
Selamat pagi. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. As you just heard, it is nighttime in the United States, and I am delighted to be with you. I've been asked to talk about a number of ethical issues involving the use of technology in child development and protection. And this is what I would like to cover this morning with you. Number one, I want to reflect on the ways in which technology has altered or changed the nature of social services and child welfare services. And the changes have been very, very dramatic. Number two, I want to identify a number of very compelling, complicated ethical issues related to professionals' increasing use of technology to serve and communicate with clients, with children, with families, professionals who are using technology to access and store digital information. Number three, I want to talk some about ethical and legal and practice standards related to what we call in the United States behavioral health and technology. And I want to highlight that ethical, legal, and practice standards are not the same thing. They are somewhat different. I'll explain that. And I want to talk about ways to protect clients. Now, all of us have been going through a very challenging time in Indonesia, in Europe, other parts of Asia, in the United States. This is what we call a Zoom fatigue syndrome support group. We're all so tired of using Zoom that we need to support each other. In my experience, consulting on ethical issues related to technology around the world, and I've been very privileged to consult on these issues all over the world, I think there are three areas where we need to be very, very knowledgeable concerning our use of technology in child welfare and in family services. Number one, ethical dilemmas, which in English we define as conflicts between practitioners' duties and obligations, difficult ethical choices. For example, you are working with a child who is very high risk with major, major problems. And ordinarily, you would like to see that child in person, or what we call face-to-face in person. But because of the pandemic, you may not be able to do that. And you have to make a difficult ethical choice about providing services to that child, knowing that the child really should be seen in person, but you do not have that opportunity. You must use technology. It's a difficult ethical choice. Or you may be using technology in a way that does not provide children and families with privacy. It's hard to protect their confidentiality. The second area we call ethical decision-making. That is, when ethical dilemmas emerge, we have to make a decision. We have to decide on a course of action in order to protect children, in order to protect families, and also to protect professionals. And that leads to the third area of what I call core or foundation ethics knowledge, what I call ethics risk management. That is very practical steps we can take First, to protect clients, that is always the most important goal, but also to protect ourselves. We call that ethics risk management. Now, I believe that in recent years, the increased use of technology in child welfare has introduced some very challenging questions that we've never faced before we use technology in the ways we are now. Number one, what do we mean by relationship? Sometimes professionals are providing services to children and families, and they never meet them in person. They never meet them face to face. It's changing the nature of relationship. Number two, who do we aim to serve? Technology can be very expensive. I know that in the United States, there are some people who are very poor. They cannot afford a smartphone. They cannot afford a data plan. And that is limiting social workers' ability to serve vulnerable, low-income people. Number three, what do we mean by privacy? Now, privacy has always been very important in child welfare, but now we have to be concerned about privacy with text messages or SMS when we use WhatsApp. We have to be concerned about privacy when we use video technology to provide services. In the United States, most child welfare professionals are using video technology. Some are using telephone, but most people are using video technology, and we must be very concerned about privacy. Who else is in the room when we speak to a child who's telling us about abuse or neglect? Number four, what are the boundaries of professional-client relationships? Now that we use technology so extensively, we have to ask questions such as, when does the workday end? Must you check your smartphone, your WhatsApp for messages late in the day because you may have a child or a parent who is in crisis? The boundaries of our relationship change. You might get a Facebook friend request from a child or a parent that raises issues of what we call professional boundaries, not only with current clients, but with former clients. We have to ask the question, is it appropriate to be a Facebook friend with a client, or is that too personal? Number five, what do we mean by informed consent? Sometimes we have to get informed consent from clients we never meet in person. It changes the nature of informed consent. Ordinarily, we would sit with a client. We would explain the services. We would explain confidentiality, but it's much more challenging when we do not meet them in person. And finally, number six, how do we manage and access clinically relevant information? Now we have the opportunity to conduct online searches for information about clients, a Google search or a Facebook search. And that raises issues about ethics. Is it appropriate to search for information about clients without their knowledge, without their consent? And I can tell you that in the United States, and I think this is probably true in Indonesia as well, clients sometimes now search for information about their social workers, about their child welfare workers. They want to know about your personal life. And often they can find information by doing that online search, that electronic search on Google or Facebook or some other search engine. And that's introducing new and challenging ethical issues. Now, those terms that you see there, those are not new ideas. Those are not new concepts. In social work, we have always been concerned about relationship and who we serve. We've always been concerned about privacy and boundaries and informed consent. These are not new issues. What is new is the way in which technology has introduced new dimensions new questions related to these age-old concepts. In my experience, traveling around the world before the pandemic and now meeting with people like this remotely, the ethical challenges related to technology in what I call the digital age are mostly related to four themes: confidentiality and privacy, what we call boundary issues and dual relationships, documentation, and also the termination of services, or what we call in the United States, client abandonment. Here are some examples of ethical challenges with which I have been dealing now for a number of years. Regarding confidentiality and privacy, I provide lots of consultation about how to protect electronic communications, to protect children's privacy, family members' privacy. I provide lots of consultation about what we call encrypted software, software designed to protect this information. I provide consultation about searching online for information about clients without their knowledge, without their consent. With regard to boundary issues and dual relationships, I mentioned some of these issues where clients sometimes search for information about social workers and child welfare professionals. We sometimes get these Facebook friend requests, or we are contacted by clients late at night. And that raises complicated issues about boundaries. Documentation. In the United States, we have a new government policy. It started in April, just a few months ago, where most clients are now allowed to access social workers and child welfare professionals' notes, their notes remotely. So a child or a parent is allowed to go on the computer, log in with a username and a password, and the agency must share the worker's notes with the client in many, many settings. Not all, but many. And that is a new national policy in the United States to enable clients to know what kinds of services they're getting. But that raises some complicated questions about how specific to be in our notes, what kind of wording we should use in our notes, given that clients may read them remotely while they're at home, or they might read them while they're in a car or sitting on a bench in a park. They might choose to share your notes with someone else. And that requires us to make very careful decisions about what we put in our notes. Regarding termination of services and what we call client abandonment, what do we do when clients need what we call a higher level of care because they're facing significant risks, but we are not able to see them in person because of the pandemic? We need to use technology. What if a client sends us an SMS or WhatsApp message and we don't see it for 3 or 4 hours and there's a crisis? Are we explaining to clients what our policies are? In the United States, we recommend that all social workers, all child welfare professionals use what we call a social media policy. A social media policy. It's a form that we give clients that explain to them when we are available using technology, when we are not available, how to contact us if there's an emergency. We explain to them we may not be available to respond to a WhatsApp message late at night. And we put this in the client's record that we explain all of this. In my experience, around the world, social workers and child welfare professionals who are using technology need to think very carefully about 3 major challenges. First, ethical mistakes. Mistakes, good people who make mistakes. They don't protect their electronic communications. They don't protect client privacy. These are mistakes. Or they share electronic records with people who should not be reading that information. And I have many, many examples of cases where this has happened. They are mistakes. Or they send an email message that includes inappropriate information. I could give you many examples. Second, deliberate ethical decisions. We need to think very carefully, I think, about how we use technology. These are not mistakes. These are decisions we make about when to provide services to clients remotely, when to provide clients access to our records remotely. These are decisions. And then, sadly, there is ethical misconduct. In the United States, I am what attorneys call an expert witness, meaning I testify in cases around the United States where a social worker or a child welfare professional is accused of ethical misconduct using technology. They exchanged inappropriate sexual messages with clients or with former clients, that kind of thing. Now, around the world, but especially in the United States, there are new standards related to technology. And I have been honored and privileged to have been involved in the development of all of these. First, there are what we call regulatory standards. So in the United States, social workers and counselors are licensed by state boards, New York State, California State, Rhode Island State. Each government licenses professionals. And these licensing or regulatory boards have developed standards related to the appropriate use of technology. And this is a type of law in the United States. And this is now happening in other nations around the world. I recently spoke to a colleague in Ireland that is developing these kinds of standards for professionals in Ireland. This is happening around the world. Second, there are what we call practice standards. There are professional associations. You have them in Indonesia. In the United States, we have them, for example, the National Association of Social Workers, a very large organization that has developed what we call practice standards related to the use of technology. And then there are ethical standards, codes of ethics. So I've been involved in the development of all of these. So for example, you see on the screen, the Code of Ethics in the United States for social workers. It says National Association of Social Workers. I was the chair of the task force that wrote this Code of Ethics in the 1990s. And recently, we added many, many standards specifically related to technology use. That's very recent. This is an example of regulatory standards. What we call the Association of Social Work Boards developed what we call model regulatory standards for technology and social work practice. I was also appointed the chair of this task force, and it took us 2 years to develop these standards that are now being used around the world. It's international. And then there are practice standards. What I'm showing you are practice standards that were developed by 4 organizations in the United States: the National Association of Social Workers, the Association of Social Work Boards, that is the organization that regulates social work, the Council on Social Work Education that oversees social work education, and then another organization called the Clinical Social Work Association. These are very large organizations. They got together and appointed a task force. They asked me to chair that task force. It took us almost 2 years to write these standards, entitled Standards for Technology and Social Work Practice. So we have new ethical standards, regulatory standards, and practice standards, and they cover 6 major topics. The documents are somewhat different, but all of them address these 6 major topics. And I don't have much time with you, so I'm going to summarize these very briefly. Informed consent related to the use of technology. Privacy and confidentiality related to the use of technology. What we call boundaries, dual relationships, and conflicts of interest related to the use of technology. Practitioner competence, if we're going to use technology, what skills do we need to have in social work and in child welfare? Standards related to records and documentation, electronic records. In the United States, we call them EHR, electronic health record, electronic medical record, and also standards related to the use of technology in our relationships with each other, what we call collegial relationships. So, for example, if you look at those 3 documents, ethical standards, regulatory standards, and practice standards, the sections on informed consent have very specific guidelines concerning verification of client identity if you do not meet them in person, making sure that the client is able to consent. They're old enough, they're competent enough to consent to services remotely. Informed consent includes explaining to clients some of the risks associated with using technology, the possibility of a confidentiality breach or violation, the possibility that we will not be available in an emergency if we are providing services remotely. Regarding privacy and confidentiality, all of those standards, the ethical standards, the regulatory standards, and the practice standards, address issues related to privacy protection and encryption. In the United States, we have lots of laws related to privacy and confidentiality using technology. We have standards concerning conducting online searches for information about clients. In the United States, and maybe in Indonesia, I don't know, many social workers provide services to groups of clients, group counseling. And it's important to have confidentiality agreements when you have multiple clients or a group of clients. Sometimes on a Zoom session, we'll bring in a family member or a friend. We call those collaterals. That's the term we use in English, collateral. We have to talk to them about privacy and confidentiality when we are providing them with services using technology. We have to make sure that clients understand exceptions to privacy and confidentiality that I list there. Regarding boundaries and dual relationships and conflicts of interest, these different standards have very specific language concerning things like online social networking, using Facebook or LinkedIn with current clients or former clients. Or you might have a Facebook friend that wants to become your client. That introduces an interesting boundary issue. You may have your own Facebook sites and clients find information about you on the internet, what I call practitioner self-disclosure. I mentioned earlier boundary issues related to clients who want to contact us late at night on days when we're not working. On this slide, I summarize the standards we developed, the ethical, the regulatory, and the practice standards related to practitioner competence. I will not take the time to read all of this, but we identified the ways in which social workers and child welfare professionals need to have training in the use of technology, need to be competent in how they use technology. Records and documentation. The standards that I just mentioned to you include details regarding encryption, to protect confidentiality, guidelines concerning clients' accessing records remotely when we're not there with them to interpret what we wrote. We have guidelines about what and how to document an email message or an SMS message, a WhatsApp message, to be sure that it's in the record if it's important. We have guidelines regarding the retention of records and communications. And in the United States, we have all kinds of laws regarding what we call record retention. And then finally, we have guidelines regarding our relationships with each other, online, electronic relationships, the importance of respect, the importance of behaving ethically. And I have been involved in several cases around the world where professionals did not treat each other respectfully electronically. Those guidelines are in those standards that I mentioned. Now, I only have a few minutes before we take a few questions, but I want to make several additional points before I conclude. You can look at these slides later if you have the time. I have summarized what the literature, what the research says are high-risk cases where ideally it may not be a good idea to provide services remotely to children who have these kinds of characteristics. And I won't take the time to read all of them. And I've been involved in some cases where children who had severe mental illness, serious trauma, did not get the help they needed because professionals relied on technology to communicate with them. In the United States and in other parts of the world, there is a very important concept that we call standard of care. Standard of care, the concept was developed by lawyers many, many years ago, and it is defined this way. What a reasonable and prudent professional, prudent means careful, what a reasonable and prudent or careful professional with the same or similar training should have done under the same or similar circumstances. Now, this is the guideline we use in the United States to determine whether professionals behaved ethically or unethically. And it has been around since the 1800s. Now we are using the same concept regarding technology. How should we be using technology in our relationships with clients? What is reasonable? What is prudent or careful? And when I am an expert witness in a court case, and I do that many, many times, I am asked to talk about the standard of care pertaining to, related to the use of technology. And on this slide, again, I won't take the time to read all of this, but I summarize what I have found to be the most useful steps we can take when we are not sure how to use technology, when we're not sure of what I call the substantive standard of care regarding the use of technology. What I say is, if we have questions about how to use technology, whether we ought to be using technology to serve clients, it is so important, I think, to get consultation, to find out what the ethical standards are in social work and in child welfare related to technology use, to be familiar with any laws or policies that might be related to the use of technology. And in the United States, there are many of those. I don't know how many there are in Indonesia, but in the United States, we have lots of them. To review those practice standards that I mentioned to you, to review literature on the use of technology in social work and child welfare. In the United States, sometimes we have to talk to a lawyer to interpret the law regarding the use of technology. In the United States, there are many child welfare and social work agencies that have what we call an ethics committee, a committee that is there for consultation if there is a difficult ethical issue. for example, related to the use of technology. And when I teach my students, I emphasize how important it is to document all the steps we take when we are making these difficult decisions. Now, again, I have only a few more minutes, so I want to point out several other slides in my PowerPoint that you may want to look at later, if you have the time and the interest. On this slide, I summarize what I think are the most important elements of informed consent when we are using technology. What to talk to clients about before we use technology to provide them with services. And it goes on for one more slide there. This slide emphasizes how important termination of what we call distance services or remote services is, so that we do not abandon clients. In the United States, there are many lawsuits that accuse social workers and child welfare professionals of abandoning, that's the legal term we use, abandoning the client because we terminated services using technology very abruptly, or we were not available when the client needed us. On this slide, again, there's a lot of detail. I will not read all of this, but I summarize what the research says about using electronic records to document services. I highlight some of the problems I have encountered around the world with so-called electronic records. Much of what I just summarized for you is included in a book that I recently wrote called Ethics and Risk Management in Online and Distance Social Work. So that's a resource. There are other publications you may want to look at if you would like more information about these issues. So with that, I have been asked to allow some time for questions before we begin the panel discussion. I hope that what I've covered has been useful.
Wah, terima kasih banyak Profesor Rimmer untuk paparannya yang sangat lengkap, sangat komprehensif. Saya sampai, mungkin teman-teman melihat, saya sampai ikut mangut-mangut ya ketika mendengarkan paparannya. Banyak sekali yang di-raise oleh Profesor Rimmer, bahkan hal-hal yang mungkin sebelumnya belum pernah kita pikirkan, seperti perkara boundaries, batasan dengan klien, dan dual relationship, bahwa tidak hanya kita yang mencari informasi tentang klien, tapi juga klien bisa saja mencari informasi tentang kita, dan itu bisa masuk ke masalah etika gitu ya. Ada banyak hal yang tadi di-raise oleh Profesor Rimmer mengenai misalnya apa saja yang perlu masuk ke dalam informed consent gitu. Ini masukan buat kami juga di Save the Children ketika ada informed consent, apa saja yang harus dimasukkan di situ. Kemudian tentang privacy dan confidentiality, tentang kerahasiaan juga ya, tadi disampaikan. Kemudian banyak lagi, dan ada standard of care yang tadi disampaikan mengenai kapan kita menggunakan teknologi gitu. Ada beberapa poin yang harus kita pertimbangkan di situ. Dan yang menarik juga ternyata ada situasi yang kita tidak bisa menggunakan teknologi dalam konteks perlindungan anak untuk teman-teman pekerja sosial ya. Dan di situ salah satunya adalah untuk anak-anak yang membutuhkan dampingan kesehatan mental. Nah, ini juga poin menarik ya, karena nanti kita ada sesi tersendiri untuk membahas ini. Dan ada penekanan bahwa kita juga perlu berkonsultasi dengan komite etik. Saya paham bahwa teman-teman pekerja sosial, baik di Kementerian Sosial, juga ada yang namanya komite etik, jadi itu menjadi satu tempat untuk kita berkonsultasi. Di sini sudah ada beberapa pertanyaan yang masuk. Saya bacakan dulu. Oke, sebentar ya. Oke, yang pertama adalah terkait dengan pelanggaran regulatori, praktikal, dan etikal. Siapa yang akan menindaklanjuti dan apakah ada sanksi-sanksinya? Kemudian tantangan apa yang dihadapi dalam penerapan standar tersebut? Nah, ini terkait dengan Profesor Rimmer sebenarnya juga saksi ahli untuk teman-teman pekerja sosial dan profesional yang melakukan pelanggaran kode etik ya. Jadi bisa menjawab hal ini. Silakan Profesor Rimmer.
Certainly. So in the United States, if a client or a family member believes that a social worker was unethical in any way, but specifically regarding the use of technology, they can go to a website and identify the social worker's name, and on the computer, they can file a complaint. They can type. In fact, I will see if I can find one for you very quickly. While I'm talking, I'll see if I can find one. And let me see if I can do that. And what happens is, in the United States at least, there's a committee at the licensing board that will meet to consider the complaint, and they will ask the social worker to respond to the complaint. Here's an example right here. So you see here, right on the website. So this is the state of Rhode Island. That's where I am right now. For those of you who are not real familiar with Rhode Island, we're near Massachusetts, New York. Okay, and it says right here that the Department of Health, I'm highlighting right here, takes complaints seriously. We will investigate and take appropriate action. And then they can go down here and they can, right on this website, they can click, they can find the name of a practitioner. I'm not going to do it. And they can then just type and file the complaint. The social worker has to respond. And then there's a meeting, a hearing. And if there is an ethics violation, then the licensing board can sanction the social worker. They can suspend a license. They can, what we call revoke a license, take it away if it's very serious. They can, what we call reprimand, and require the social worker to get consultation about their mistake. So sometimes they will ask me to meet with the social worker to discuss what happened. And so there are different kinds of sanctions. And some of the cases that I am involved in right now involve technology, allegations that the social worker did not protect confidentiality or was not appropriate or not polite when they sent SMS or WhatsApp messages to a client, insulting messages. There are lots of ways in which there can be a problem. And I've been involved in several cases, sadly, where there was sexual content in the communications electronically.
Wah, menarik sekali ya dari jawaban Profesor Rimmer. Mudah-mudahan menjawab pertanyaan yang barusan. Saya akan menyampaikan lagi pertanyaan yang kedua, Prof, dari Ibu Nurliana di Universitas Pajajaran. Menarik tentang social media regulation. Siapa yang merancang social media regulation tersebut? Dan apakah boleh berbeda-beda untuk setiap lembaga ataukah sama berlaku di level nasional? Silakan, Prof.
It's both. And I'll be very brief. I know we don't have much time. So there are national ethics standards in the United States. And all social workers are expected to comply with them. But ethics standards are not always government standards. In other words, it's the professional association, the National Association of Social Workers. Then the states sometimes have their own regulations. New York, Massachusetts, California, Texas, Rhode Island. And so there can be national policies and laws. There can be state policies and laws. And then there are policies that are developed by professional associations that are NGOs, they're not government organizations. So social workers can be held accountable in many different ways. And you can take a look at those documents that I shared with you to get examples of how these policies are implemented in the United States.
Baik, terima kasih banyak Profesor Rimmer. Teman-teman peserta, nanti apabila ada yang membutuhkan materi dari Profesor Rimmer, karena tadi ada beberapa referensi yang ditampilkan di presentasinya, nanti kita akan sediakan link untuk teman-teman juga bisa mengakses materinya Profesor Rimmer. Profesor Rimmer, terakhir sebelum kita tutup, apakah ada closing statement dari Profesor Rimmer? Silahkan.
I do. I'll be very brief. Number one, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's been a privilege to spend this time with you. I want to thank you for the very important work you do on behalf of children and families. This is obviously a worldwide challenge regarding child welfare. I want to thank you for the work that you do. I hope that the information I gave you will be useful. It was very brief. It usually takes me many weeks to cover this material, and I had 30 minutes, that's all. So I gave you what we say the headlines. But I hope that has given you some understanding of how complicated these issues are. So I thank you for being with me, and sampai jumpa lagi.
Oh, wah, luar biasa. Profesor Rimmer sudah jago berbahasa Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak Profesor Rimmer ya. Mudah-mudahan ini bukan kesempatan terakhir kami menghadirkan Profesor Rimmer di Indonesia. Semoga bisa berjumpa lagi betul-betul di kesempatan berikutnya. Demikian teman-teman, terima kasih banyak. Mohon maaf apabila ada pertanyaan yang belum terbacakan oleh saya. Saya undur diri, saya serahkan kepada Mas Antia. Terima kasih kepada Profesor Rimmer dan juru bahasa isyarat, juga teman-teman penterjemah yang sudah membantu menerjemahkan sesi ini. Terima kasih banyak, over to you Mas Antia.